A simple typo usually leads to a momentary blush of embarrassment. For Claire Dawson, it led to a bloodbath. Cornered behind a hollow-core bedroom door that was splintering under the heavy boots of a man who carried a badge by day and a black heart by night, Claire fumbled with her dying phone. She needed her brother, Ryan. She needed a miracle. But terror has a way of making fingers clumsy. She was one digit off. That frantic plea for life didn't reach her brother's cracked screen. Instead, it lit up a phone buried in a silk-lined drawer. The personal burner of Grant Blackwood, the most feared shadow in Chicago's underworld. It was a device that had remained silent since the funeral of his sister Abigail 3 years ago. What happens when a nurse trained to save lives accidentally summons the one man who specializes in ending them? The answer is a transformation that began with a text and ended in a war. The heavy, rhythmic thud against the bedroom door was the only clock Claire had left. Each kick splintered the wood a little more. A frantic countdown to the moment Daniel Cross would finish what he'd started in the kitchen. Claire huddled on the cold tile of the ensuite bathroom, her lungs hitching against the agony of her crushed ribs. With trembling fingers, she stared at the glowing screen of her phone. One message sent, one message received. "I'm on my way." The words were cold, clipped, and utterly unfamiliar. She didn't know who had sent them. It wasn't the frantic, rambling reply she expected from her brother Ryan, but the sheer certainty of the text held her together as the bedroom door finally gave way with a sickening crash of ruptured timber. "Claire? Sweetheart?" "Stop making this difficult," Daniel's voice drifted in, terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man who knew the law was on his side because he wore it like armor. "You know how this ends. You come out, we talk, and maybe I don't tell the precinct you tripped while resisting arrest." Claire pressed her palm over her mouth to stifle a whimper. The bathroom door was the last line of defense, a flimsy piece of pressed board against a man who broke bones for sport. She heard his heavy footsteps cross the carpet, slow and deliberate. He stopped right outside the bathroom. He didn't kick the door this time. He just leaned against it. "I can hear you breathing, Claire. It sounds painful. You should really let me take a look at those ribs." Suddenly a different sound cut through the oppressive silence of the apartment. It wasn't the frantic shouting of a neighbor or the siren of a patrol car. It was the sound of the front door. The heavy, reinforced steel door Claire had installed 6 months ago, being torn off its hinges. There was no knock, no warning, just a singular, violent boom that vibrated through the floorboards. In the bedroom, Daniel froze. "Police, who's there?" he shouted, his instinct for authority kicking in. He drew his service weapon, his footsteps moving away from Claire as he headed toward the living room to confront the intruder. "I am a detective with the Chicago PD. Identify yourself." Claire crawled toward the bathroom door, pressing her ear to the wood. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. "You're a long way from your precinct, Detective Cross," a voice replied. It was deep, resonant, and possessed a terrifying stillness. It wasn't the voice of a hero. It was the voice of a man who owned the darkness Daniel only played in. "Grant Blackwood," Daniel gasped, his bravado vanishing in a sharp intake of breath. "What the hell is this?" "This is a domestic matter. You have no business here." "I have the only business that matters," Grant replied. "You used a phone that belongs to me. You sent a cry for help to a ghost, and in doing so, you woke me up." The sound of a struggle was brief but brutal. A muffled grunt, the clatter of a firearm hitting the hardwood, and then the unmistakable sound of a body being slammed against a wall with enough force to rattle the kitchen cabinets. Claire finally found the courage to turn the lock. She pushed the door open, clutching her side as she leaned against the frame for support. The living room was a crime scene of a different sort. Daniel Cross, the man who had loomed over Claire's life like a shadow for 2 years, was pinned against the wall. Grant Blackwood held him there with one hand clamped around Daniel's throat. Grant was taller than she imagined, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked out of place amidst the carnage of her broken furniture. His face was a mask of cold stone, his eyes dark and devoid of mercy. Behind him stood Mason Reed, a mountain of a man who moved with the silent efficiency of a predator, already scanning the room for further threats. "Grant, please," Daniel wheezed, his face turning a mottled purple. I'm a cop. You kill me, they'll bring the whole city down on you. Grant leaned in, his voice a low, lethal whisper that reached Claire even across the room. The city already belongs to me, Daniel. You're just a stray dog I've allowed to bark, but you bit something that wasn't yours. Grant's gaze shifted, finding Claire standing in the doorway. He looked at her blood-stained scrub top, the way she favored her left side, and the haunted, hollow look in her eyes. For a flickering second, the coldness in his expression fractured, replaced by a jagged, ancient grief. He wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at the ghost of the sister he couldn't save. He turned back to Daniel, his grip tightening. You used these hands to break her? It was an accident. Daniel choked out. She fell. Grant didn't argue. He didn't yell. He simply nodded to Mason. Hold him. Mason stepped forward, pinning Daniel's arms against the wall with effortless strength. Grant reached out and took Daniel's right hand in his. A surgeon's hands are for healing, Grant said softly, his voice echoing Claire's own profession. A nurse's hands are for comfort, but your hands, detective, they are only for hurting. Claire watched, paralyzed, as Grant applied a slow, agonizing pressure. The first pop was the loudest. Daniel's scream was cut short as Mason slammed his head back against the wall. One by one, Grant dismantled the bones in Daniel's fingers with the precision of a man who understood exactly how much pain the human body could endure before slipping into shock. Now he knows, Grant whispered, loud enough only for the room to hear. He isn't the biggest predator in this city. Grant let the broken detective slump to the floor, a heap of ruined pride and shattered bone. He didn't spare Daniel a second look. Instead, he walked toward Claire. Every instinct she had told her to flinch, to run, to hide. But as he stopped a few feet away, he didn't reach for her. He simply stood there, an immovable wall between her and the man who had hurt her. Claire Dawson, he said, her name sounding like a vow in his mouth. My name is Grant Blackwood. You sent a message. I'm here to tell you that the message was received. He looked down at her bruised side, his jaw tightening. You're a nurse. You know you're bleeding internally. I have a punctured lung, I think, Claire managed to whisper, her voice cracking. Then the healing starts now, Grant said. He stepped closer, and for the first time in 2 years, Claire didn't feel the urge to retreat. He leaned down, carefully sliding one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, shielding her face against his chest so she wouldn't have to look at Daniel on the floor. As he carried her out past the shattered door and into the cool night air of Chicago, Claire felt a strange, terrifying shift in the universe. The man holding her wasn't a savior in any traditional sense. He was a monster who had just broken another man without blinking. But as Grant Blackwood settled her into the back of a waiting black SUV, his hand lingered briefly on her shoulder. No one touches you again, he promised. The engine roared to life, leaving the screams of Daniel Cross behind in the dark. The kingpin had shown his mercy, but as the city lights blurred past the window, Claire realized that mercy was a luxury she would never know again. She was no longer a victim, but she was no longer free. She was a guest of the devil, and the war for her soul had only just begun. The black SUV moved through the rain-slicked streets of Chicago like a phantom, the tires humming a low dirge against the asphalt. Inside, the cabin was a cocoon of leather and silence, broken only by the shallow, ragged hitching of Claire's breath. Grant Blackwood sat beside her, his silhouette sharp and immovable against the passing blur of city lights. He didn't look at her, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, a controlled, vibrating intensity that felt like being trapped in a cage with a sleeping lion. Grant's hand remained on the door handle, his knuckles still stained with the faint copper smear of Daniel's blood. He hadn't wiped it away. To him, it wasn't a stain. It was a receipt. Mason, Grant said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Call Nathan. Tell him we're 5 minutes out. I want the surgical suite prepped and a unit of O- on standby. Already done, boss. Mason Reed replied from the front seat, his eyes never leaving the rearview mirror, watching for the flickering blue lights of a pursuit that hadn't come yet. But we have a problem. Cross wasn't alone. Dispatch is already squawking about a 1054 at the Dawson residence. Hayes is already moving units. Grant finally turned his head, His eyes caught the light of a street lamp, turning them into cold chips of flint. Let them move. Captain Hayes knows the price of stepping onto my land. If he wants to turn this into a precinct war over a detective who couldn't keep his hands to himself, I'll give him one. Claire tried to shift, but the movement sent a fresh spike of agony through her chest. She gasped, her vision narrowing to a pinprick. Suddenly, a large, warm hand settled over hers. It didn't squeeze, it simply provided an anchor. "Don't try to speak, Claire," Grant said, his tone softening just enough to be dangerous. "You've spent 2 years being told what to do by a man who used fear as a leash. That ends tonight. But your body is failing you. Let the doctor do the work." My brother," she managed to wheeze, her fingers clutching at the expensive fabric of Grant's sleeve. "Daniel. He'll go after Ryan. Your brother is being moved to a safe house in the North Woods as we speak," Grant replied. "He's safe. Safer than he's ever been. Because now he belongs to the Blackwood interest. And I don't lose my interests." The SUV veered off the main road, passing through a set of iron gates that looked more like the entrance to a fortress than a home. The Blackwood estate was a sprawling expanse of stone and shadows, hidden behind high walls and state-of-the-art surveillance. As the vehicle pulled into the heated garage, the doors hissed shut behind them, sealing out the world of sirens and badges. The door opened, and a man in a white lab coat stood waiting. Dr. Nathan Cole didn't look like a mob doctor. He looked like a man who belonged in a high-end university hospital. But the way he nodded to Grant, with a mix of deep respect and professional distance, told a different story. Grant lifted Claire from the seat again. He didn't wait for a gurney. He carried her through the pristine halls of the estate, past oil paintings and mahogany furniture, into a wing that smelled of antiseptic and ozone. "Put her here, Grant," Dr. Cole instructed, gesturing to a surgical table. As Grant lowered her onto the cold surface, Claire caught a glimpse of his face in the harsh LED surgical lights. The rage was gone, replaced by a haunting, distant look. He was staring at the jagged diamond necklace she wore, a gift from her mother, but he wasn't seeing the jewelry. He was seeing the ghost of Abigail. "She has a tension pneumothorax," Dr. Cole muttered, his hands moving with practiced speed as he cut away the remains of Claire's scrub top. "Grant, you need to leave. I can't have you hovering while I'm chest tubing her." Grant didn't move. He stood at the head of the table, looking down at Claire. Her skin was gray, her lips tinged with blue. "Save her, Nathan," Grant said, his voice a low growl. "If she dies, the city burns. I'm not losing another sister to a man with a badge." "She's not your sister, Grant," the doctor said firmly. "She's a patient. Now get out." Grant's jaw tightened, but he finally stepped back. Before he left, he leaned down, his face inches from Claire's. "Fight, Claire. You're a nurse. You know the mechanics of survival. Do not let that coward win by giving up now." As the heavy doors clicked shut behind him, the slow pacing of the recovery began. The next hour was a blur of sharp stabs of pain, the hiss of oxygen, and the steady, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor. Claire felt the pressure in her chest release as the tube was inserted, a violent rush of air that allowed her lungs to finally expand. She drifted in and out of a drug-induced haze. In the brief moments of clarity, she saw the opulence of the room. This wasn't a hospital, it was a gilded cage. Every piece of equipment was top of the line, but the windows were reinforced with steel mesh. Hours later, the sun began to bleed through the curtains, casting long, golden shadows across the room. Claire woke to the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Grant was sitting in the corner, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He hadn't changed his clothes. He looked tired, but his presence still filled the room like a heavy weight. "The doctor says you'll live," Grant said, not looking up from his glass. "But Daniel is already spinning a story. He's claiming I kidnapped you, that I attacked a police officer in the line of duty. He's calling for a multi-agency task force." Claire swallowed, her throat feeling like it was filled with glass. You should have let me go. You've put a target on your back for a stranger." Grant finally looked up. He stood and walked to the side of her bed, looking down at her with an expression that was impossible to read. "You aren't a stranger, Claire. You're the woman who called the devil for help, and in my world, that's a contract." He reached out, his thumb brushing against the edge of the bandage on her ribs. "Control has a cost. Daniel thinks his badge gives him the right to own you. I think my power gives me the right to destroy him. The only question is, what are you willing to pay to watch him fall?" Claire looked into those dark, bottomless eyes and realized the terrifying truth. She was no longer being hunted by a detective. She was being protected by a kingpin. And as the distant sound of a helicopter began to throb in the air, she knew the bill for her life was about to come due. The sedation finally ebbed away, leaving Claire in a state of hyperlucidity. The air in this wing of the estate felt different. Thicker, cooler, and heavy with the scent of dried lavender and old books. As she grew stronger, she was moved from the clinical starkness of the surgical suite to a bedroom that felt like a time capsule. The room was vast, decorated in soft creams and muted teals, but it was the silence that felt loudest. There was no hum of hospital machinery here, only the distant rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway. Claire sat up in the mahogany four-poster bed, her ribs tightly bound in medical-grade compression wraps. On the nightstand sat a single framed photograph, a young woman with a laugh that seemed to radiate through the glass, her arm linked with a younger, less scarred Grant Blackwood. "That was Abigail," a voice said from the shadows near the balcony. Claire jumped slightly, her hand flying to her side. Grant was standing by the heavy velvet curtains, silhouetted against the gray Chicago morning. He looked less like a kingpin in this light and more like a man haunting his own home. "She looks happy," Claire whispered, her voice still raspy. She was, until the world reminded her who her brother was. Grant walked toward the bed, his gaze fixed on the photo. "This was her wing. I haven't let anyone sleep here in 3 years. Not even the staff are allowed to dust in here unless I'm watching." Claire looked around at the pristine surfaces, the rows of medical textbooks on the shelves, and the small, delicate easel in the corner. "She was a student?" "Pre-med," Grant said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips before vanishing. "She wanted to be exactly what you are. Someone who fixes things. Someone who doesn't have to break them to survive." He turned to Claire, his dark eyes searching hers. "When your message came through on her phone, I thought it was a cruel joke. Then I saw the words. He broke my ribs." Abigail's last message to me was almost identical. The weight of the revelation settled over Claire like a shroud. She wasn't just a victim he had rescued, she was a second chance at a penance he could never fully pay. "I'm sorry," Claire said softly. "I didn't mean to wake up your grief. Grief doesn't sleep in this house, Claire. It just waits." Grant sat in the armchair beside her bed. "While you were out, Mason ran a deep scan on Daniel Cross's digital footprint. He's been using police databases to track your brother's location for months. He didn't just want you back. He was planning to use Ryan as leverage to keep you silent forever." Claire felt the familiar cold coil of fear in her gut. If Daniel is as connected as you say, he'll find a way into this estate. He's a detective. He knows how to find holes in a defense. "He knows how to find holes in legal defenses," Grant corrected. "But he's never encountered a Blackwood blackout. This house is off the grid. The local precinct has been told that any officer crossing the perimeter without a signed warrant from a judge I don't already own will be treated as an armed intruder." Grant stood up and walked to the closet, pulling out a silk robe. He laid it at the foot of the bed. "Dr. Cole says you need to walk. Movement prevents the lungs from scarring. When you're ready, come to the library. There's someone you need to meet." An hour later, Claire made her way down the long, silent corridor. The silent wing lived up to its name. The walls were thick, the carpet dampening every footfall. She found Grant in the library, but he wasn't alone. A man with a nervous twitch and a rumpled suit sat across from him, clutching a briefcase like a shield. "This is Arthur Penhaligon," Grant said, gesturing to the man. "He's an internal affairs consultant. Or he was, until he realized that Daniel Cross and Captain Hayes were skimming from the evidence lockers to fund their own private security firm." Arthur looked at Claire, his eyes wide with a mix of pity and terror. "I tried to report it, Miss Dawson, but the paper trail always vanished. Hayes has friends in the mayor's office. They don't see Daniel as a monster. They see him as a highly decorated officer who gets results." Claire felt a surge of indignation. "Results? He broke my ribs because I left the light on. He's a criminal with a badge." Which is why we aren't going to the police, Grant intervened. He walked over to a large oak table where a map of the city was spread out, marked with several red circles. We are going to dismantle his support system, one link at a time, starting with Captain Hayes. Claire looked at the map, then at Grant. You're starting a war. The war started the moment he stepped into your apartment. Grant said. He looked at her, his expression unyielding. I've spent 3 years being a ghost, Claire, but for you, I'll be the Reaper. I've already contacted Jack Turner. If things get loud, he'll have the extraction bird ready in 5 minutes. As Arthur began to lay out files, photos of Daniel meeting with known Russian associates, bank statements, and transcripts of illegal wiretaps, Claire realized the slow recovery phase was over. She was no longer just healing, she was being briefed. The Silent Wing was the only place in Chicago where the truth could be told. But as the sun set over the estate, the shadows grew longer, and Claire knew that Daniel Cross was out there, regrouping, fueled by a humiliation that only blood could wash away. Grant, she called out as he prepared to leave the room. He stopped at the door. Why me? There are thousands of people in this city who need help. Grant looked back at her, his hand resting on the doorframe. Because you were the only one who had the courage to hit send when the devil was the only one listening. The smell of hospital-grade disinfectant and old blood clung to Daniel Cross like a second skin. He sat on the edge of a gurney in a secluded exam room at the 14th District Precinct, his hands encased in heavy plaster casts that felt like concrete weights. The agony in his shattered fingers was a dull, throbbing roar, but it was nothing compared to the white-hot humiliation cauterizing his mind. He was a detective. He was the law. And he had been dismantled in his own living room by a man who didn't even bother to draw a gun. The door creaked open, and Captain Robert Hayes stepped in, his face a mask of weary irritation. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, crossing his arms. He didn't look at Daniel with sympathy. He looked at him like a liability that refused to go away. You're lucky the boys found you before the paramedics did, Daniel, Hayes said, his voice low and gravelly. If this hit the official wire, I couldn't protect you. A detective beaten into the floor by Grant Blackwood? It makes the whole department look like his personal doormat. Daniel looked up, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a manic intensity. He took her, Robert. He breached my home, assaulted a peace officer, and kidnapped Claire Dawson. This isn't just about me anymore. This is a direct hit on the badge. Don't give me that badge crap, Hayes snapped, stepping into the light. We both know why you were there. We both know what you did to her. My phone has been ringing off the hook with neighbors reporting domestic disturbances and gunfire. I've spent 3 hours scrubbing the 911 logs so internal affairs doesn't come sniffing around your shattered furniture. Daniel let out a jagged, painful laugh. You think scrubbing logs is enough? Blackwood has her? He's got her at that fortress of his. And you know as well as I do that if he gets her to talk, it isn't just my career on the line. Who do you think she's going to tell about the extra evidence we've been moving? Who do you think she's going to tell about the private security contracts you signed with the people Blackwood is currently squeezing out of the West Side? Hayes stiffened. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. The corruption in the Chicago PD wasn't a secret to those within it, but it was a delicate ecosystem. One that required silence and the absence of high-profile victims. She's a nurse, Daniel continued, his voice dropping to a persuasive, venomous hiss. She's fragile. She's scared. Blackwood is going to frame it as a rescue, and the DA will eat it up. But if we move now, if we frame this as a high-priority kidnapping and a rescue operation of a civilian by the police, we don't just get her back. We get the warrant we've wanted for 5 years. We get to breach the Blackwood estate legally. Hayes paced the small room, his boots clicking rhythmically on the linoleum. You're talking about a full-scale tactical raid on a private estate. Without a rock-solid witness or a visual on the victim, no judge will touch the warrant. Then we make one, Daniel said, lifting his heavy casted hands. Look at me. This is the witness. Blackwood is a violent felon with a history of underworld activity. I was investigating a lead on a missing person. He ambushed me, and he grabbed Claire as a human shield. It's a classic kidnapping in progress. If we wait, he kills her to cover his tracks. That's the story, Robert. That's the only story that saves both our necks. Hayes stopped pacing. He looked at Daniel, broken, obsessive, and dangerous, and then he looked at the door. He was a man who had built his life on the cautious side of corruption, always keeping enough distance from the fire to avoid getting burned. But Daniel was right. Claire Dawson knew too much, and Grant Blackwood was the only man in the city with enough power to make her voice heard. "I can get a tactical team together," Hayes said slowly, the gears of a conspiracy beginning to turn. "But it has to be off the books until the breach is made. I'll call it an emergency response. We'll use the exigent circumstances clause. No warrant needed if we believe a life is in immediate danger." "It is," Daniel whispered, a dark, twisted grin spreading across his face. "Her life is in more danger than she could ever imagine." Hayes pulled out his burner phone, his thumb hovering over the contact for the SWAT commander he had on payroll. "If this goes sideways, Daniel, if we go in there and she isn't there, or if we start a war we can't finish, I will hand you to Blackwood myself to save my own skin. Understand?" "She's there," Daniel said, his voice cracking with a mixture of pain and triumph. "She's in Abigail's wing. I know how he thinks. He thinks he's found a replacement for the sister he lost. He's emotional. He's weak. He's playing hero while I'm playing chess." As Hayes left the room to coordinate the strike, Daniel leaned his head back against the cold tile wall. The pain in his hands didn't matter anymore. He could already see the images on the news. The brave police officers rescuing the kidnapped nurse from the clutches of the city's most notorious criminal. He would get his hands back on her. He would remind her that no matter who she texted, no matter what devil she summoned, she still belonged to the law. And in this city, Daniel Cross was the law. The grudge had been fed. Now the badge was being sharpened into a weapon. Outside, the first few police cruisers began to assemble in the darkened lot of the precinct, their lights off, their engines idling. A silent predator preparing to strike the lion in his den. The transition from the clinical safety of the estate to the cold reality of the city was jarring. While Daniel Cross was sharpening his badge into a blade at the precinct, Ryan Dawson was finding out that being the brother of a woman who summoned the devil came with a heavy, golden price. Ryan Dawson sat in the back of a nondescript black sedan, his hands gripped so tightly around his backpack that his knuckles were white. He was 22, a grad student who had spent the last 2 years trying to play the role of the protective younger brother, only to be thwarted by a sister who hid her bruises and a detective who owned the streets. Now he was being escorted by 2 men who looked like they were carved out of granite. "Where are you taking me?" Ryan asked for the 10th time. "I need to see Claire. If she's hurt, I'm the one who should be there." Mason Reed, sitting in the passenger seat, didn't turn around. He just watched the side mirror for tails. "Your sister is at the Blackwood estate. She's stable. But right now, you are the only leverage Daniel Cross has left. As long as you're on the street, you're a target." "I don't even know who Grant Blackwood is," Ryan snapped. "All I know is that my sister is in a mobster's house because of a typo." "That typo saved her life," Mason replied flatly. "And if you want to keep yours, you'll stop shouting and start listening." The car pulled into a secluded parking garage under a luxury high-rise, one of the many safe houses Grant maintained for his inner circle. As they stepped out, a familiar figure was waiting near the elevator. It was Captain Robert Hayes. Ryan froze. He recognized Hayes from the precinct. He was the man who had always brushed off Ryan's concerns about Daniel's temper. "Ryan," Hayes said, putting on his best, concerned officer face. "Thank God we found you. We have information that your sister has been abducted by the Blackwood organization. They're dangerous, son. They're using her to get to the department." Ryan looked from Hayes to Mason, his heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment of the split, the choice between the law that had failed his sister and the criminal who had saved her. "He's lying," Mason said, his voice a low warning. He didn't draw a weapon, but the tension in his shoulders was a coiled spring. "The captain here is on Daniel's payroll. He isn't here to rescue Claire. He's here to take you so they can force Claire to sign a statement recanting everything Daniel did to her." Hayes stepped forward, his hand resting on his holster. "Ryan, don't listen to him. I'm a captain of the Chicago PD. Who are you going to trust? A career criminal's henchman? Or the police? Ryan looked at Hayes's polished shoes, then remembered the way Daniel used to walk into their house like he owned the air they breathed. He remembered the accidental falls Claire had, and how Hayes had personally signed the report saying there was no evidence of foul play. If you're here to help, Ryan said, his voice trembling but clear, then where is the warrant for Daniel's arrest? My sister is in a hospital bed because of him. Why are you standing in a garage talking to me instead of putting him in a cell? Hayes's expression hardened. The facade of the concerned officer cracked, revealing the cold, bureaucratic predator beneath. Don't be a fool, kid. You're choosing the wrong side of history. I'm choosing my sister, Ryan said. He stepped back, moving closer to Mason. Hayes let out a short, sharp whistle. Suddenly, two plainclothes officers stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, their weapons drawn. I tried to do this the easy way, Ryan, but for the sake of the investigation, I'm taking you into protective custody. Before the officers could close the gap, the screech of tires echoed through the garage. A second SUV, this one driven by Jack Turner, roared around the corner, fishtailing into a perfect block between Ryan and the officers. Get in, Mason shouted, grabbing Ryan by the scruff of his jacket and shoving him toward the open door. A single shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the concrete floor, but Mason and Ryan were already inside. As Jack shifted the vehicle into reverse and tore out of the garage, Ryan looked out the back window. He saw Captain Hayes standing there, his face contorted in rage, reaching for his radio. He's calling it in. Ryan panted, the adrenaline finally hitting his system. He's going to tell them we're the ones who attacked him. Let him, Mason said, checking his own weapon. By the time they coordinate a response, you'll be behind walls they can't climb. Ryan leaned back against the seat, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He had made his choice. He had stepped off the map of the legal world and into the shadows of Grant Blackwood. He was no longer a grad student. He was a fugitive in a war he didn't understand. But as he thought of Claire's face, he knew he would do it again. The following days at the Blackwood estate were measured in the steady rhythm of recovery and the unsettling stillness of a fortress waiting for a siege. Claire was no longer confined to the surgical wing, but the freedom of the house was an illusion. Every hallway was monitored by silent cameras, and every window was reinforced with ballistic glass. Claire stood in the estate's expansive glass conservatory, the afternoon sun warming the lush greenery that seemed defiant against the cold stone of the walls. She was practicing her breathing exercises, a grim necessity to keep her punctured lung from collapsing. Grant found her there, not with a weapon or a glass of scotch, but with a stack of medical files. Dr. Cole says you're restless, Grant said, leaning against a cast-iron pillar. He says a trauma nurse who isn't working is a dangerous thing. I'm used to being the one holding the bandages, not the one wearing them, Claire replied, turning to him. She noticed he was wearing a simple black sweater, the sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms corded with tension. It's hard to feel like myself when I'm surrounded by all this. Grant stepped closer, handing her the files. Then be yourself. These are the medical records for the men on my security detail. Most of them have old injuries, shrapnel, poorly set fractures, chronic pain. They don't trust hospitals, and they don't like Cole because he talks down to them. They might listen to you. Claire flipped through the pages, her professional instincts sparking to life. She saw names like Mason Reed and Jack Turner, along with a dozen others. Their histories were maps of violence, gunshot wounds, blunt force trauma, and signs of long-term physical neglect. You want me to be their medic? She asked. I want you to have a reason to get out of bed that doesn't involve looking over your shoulder, Grant said. His voice was unusually soft. And perhaps you can teach me something. Over the next week, the power dynamic in the house shifted. In the mornings, Claire set up a makeshift clinic in the library. She treated Mason's recurring shoulder dislocation and showed Jack Turner how to manage the nerve damage in his leg from an old crash. She spoke to them not as the boss's guest, but as a peer. They began to see her not as a liability to be protected, but as an asset who kept them in the fight. One evening, as the shadows lengthened over the conservatory, Grant joined her. He watched as she organized a trauma kit, her movements fluid and precise. "Show me," he said, gesturing to the medical supplies. "Show me how to stop a bleed, properly." Claire hesitated, then reached for a roll of gauze and a training mannequin. "You spend your life breaking things, Grant. Are you sure you want to know how to fix them?" "If the war comes to this house," Grant said, his eyes meeting hers with a piercing intensity, "I may not be the one who needs fixing. I need to know I can keep you alive until Cole can get to you." The lesson was intimate and clinical at the same time. Claire took his large, calloused hands in hers, guiding them as he practiced applying a tourniquet and packing a simulated wound. She felt the vibration of his pulse against her palms, steady, slow, and terrifyingly calm. "You're too tight with the wrap," she whispered, her face inches from his. "You have to leave room for the tissue to breathe, or you'll lose the limb." "I don't like leaving room for error," Grant replied. In that moment, the price of peace became clear to Claire. It wasn't just the security or the luxury, it was the slow, inevitable melding of their worlds. She was teaching a killer how to preserve life, while he was teaching her the cold logistics of survival. The trauma nurse and the crime lord were finding a middle ground built on the shared language of scars. The peace was shattered by the sharp chirp of Grant's encrypted radio. Mason's voice came through, distorted but urgent. "Boss, we have a problem. A convoy of 3 blacked-out SUVs just cleared the first waypoint on the North Road. No sirens, but they're running tactical frequencies. It's Hayes. He's not waiting for a warrant." Grant's hand dropped from the gauze, his entire posture snapping back into that of a predator. The softness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating iron. "Take Claire to the silent wing," Grant ordered into the radio. He turned to her, his hand lingering on her arm for a fraction of a second. "The lesson is over, Claire. Now we see if the armor holds." As Claire was hurried away by Mason, she looked back at the conservatory. The peaceful greenery was now shrouded in darkness, and the silhouette of Grant Blackwood against the glass looked like a king preparing for his final stand. The time for healing had passed. The time for the breach had arrived. The transition from the quiet intimacy of the conservatory to the cold precision of a tactical lockdown was instantaneous. As the estate's exterior lights cut out, plunging the grounds into a strategic, ink-black darkness, the silent wing transformed into a command center. Claire was hurried down a service staircase by Mason, her pulse thundering against her healing ribs. She could hear the heavy mechanical clunk of steel shutters sliding into place over the windows of the lower floors. The estate wasn't just a home, it was a bunker. "Stay low and stay behind me," Mason grunted, his hand hovering over the grip of his sidearm. "Hayes is running a dark op, no sirens, no local backup. He's trying to hit us fast before anyone can call the governor." They reached the security hub, a room filled with glowing monitors that flickered with infrared views of the perimeter. Grant was already there, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked like a general surveying a battlefield. On the screens, 3 black SUVs had breached the outer gates, their tires crushing the manicured hedges. Figures in tactical gear spilled out, moving with the disciplined cadence of a SWAT unit. "They're using the service entrance," Grant observed, his voice devoid of emotion. "They think the back of the house is the weak point. Mason, tell the boys to hold fire until they cross the secondary threshold. I want them deep enough in the kill zone that Hayes can't claim they were just investigating from the street." Claire watched the monitors in horror. She saw a figure she recognized instantly, even through the grainy green of the night vision feed. Daniel Cross was there, his arms in heavy tactical slings over his chest, his face twisted in a snarl of anticipation as he directed the officers toward the heavy oak doors of the servants' quarters. "He's here," Claire whispered, her hand instinctively going to her side. "Daniel is with them." Grant didn't look away from the screen. "I know, he wants his prize back, but he's forgotten that in this house, the law of the land doesn't apply. Only the law of the shadow." Suddenly, the monitors hissed with static. "They're jamming the frequencies," Mason called out. "We've lost the exterior feeds. Thermal sensors are still up, but they're cutting the power lines to the main grid." A low, vibrating rumble shook the floorboards as a breaching charge detonated at the rear of the house. The sound was followed by the sharp, rhythmic pop, pop, pop of suppressed gunfire. The war had officially moved indoors. "Mason, take the east corridor." "Jack is on the roof with the bird," Grant commanded. He turned to Claire, grabbing a small, encrypted handset and thrusting it into her hand. "If I don't meet you at the extraction point in 10 minutes, you leave with Jack. You go to the safe house in Wisconsin." "I'm not leaving you," Claire said, the nurse in her refusing to abandon a patient, even one as dangerous as Grant. "This isn't a hospital, Claire. It's a slaughterhouse," Grant snapped, but his hand lingered on her shoulder for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Go. Now." Mason grabbed Claire's arm, pulling her toward the hidden elevator that led to the helipad. As the doors began to slide shut, Claire saw Grant draw a customized .45 from a hidden drawer. He didn't look back. He walked toward the sound of the gunfire, moving with a terrifying, predator-like grace. The elevator climbed, but halfway up, the car lurched and groaned to a halt. The emergency lights flickered a sickly red. "They've cut the secondary power," Mason cursed, punching the controls. "We're stuck between floors." Above them, through the elevator's ceiling hatch, the sound of the helicopter's rotors began to throb, but beneath them, the sounds of the breach were growing louder. Screams, the crashing of glass, and the heavy thud of boots on stone filled the shaft. Then a voice echoed up from the darkness below, amplified by the confined space. "Claire, I know you're in there." Daniel's voice was ragged, fueled by pain and madness. "You think Blackwood can save you? I'm gonna burn this house down with both of you inside." "There's nowhere left to hide, Claire. Nowhere." Claire looked at Mason, then at the hatch above. Her fear was there, but beneath it, the training she'd practiced with Grant in the conservatory took hold. She reached into her medical bag, her fingers closing around a heavy surgical scalpel. She wasn't the victim in the bathroom anymore. She was the one holding the blade. The air in the elevator shaft was a cocktail of hydraulic fluid and cordite. Mason didn't wait for the doors to move. He braced his back against one wall and his boots against the other, leveraging himself toward the ceiling hatch. "Up, Claire, now!" Mason hissed, hauling her through the small opening, just as a burst of gunfire shredded the metal floor of the car from below. They scrambled onto the roof of the elevator, then began a frantic climb up the emergency ladder. Above them, the heavy thrum of rotors grew into a deafening roar. As they emerged onto the rooftop helipad, the world was a chaos of strobe lights and freezing rain. Jack Turner's helicopter sat idling, its blades slicing through the mist like a vengeful spirit. "Where is he?" Jack screamed over the engine noise, his hands tight on the cyclic. "I've got 3 bogies on the stairwell. We have to move." "Grant's still down there," Claire shouted back, but her words were swallowed by a sudden explosion from the floor below. The rooftop door blew outward and Grant Blackwood emerged, but he wasn't the untouchable kingpin anymore. His suit was torn, and a dark, spreading stain soaked his shoulder. He was firing backward into the stairwell, his movements sluggish. Behind him, 3 tactical officers, not in standard uniform, but in the black kits Daniel had authorized, surged onto the roof. "Get her on the bird," Grant roared, stumbling toward them. Mason grabbed Claire, practically throwing her into the cabin of the helicopter. But as Grant reached for the rail, a shot rang out from the doorway. He spun, his leg giving way, and he collapsed onto the wet concrete of the helipad. Daniel Cross stepped out from the shadows of the cooling vents, his casts glinting in the strobe lights, a weapon held awkwardly but steadily in his fractured grip. "End of the line, Grant. You're not leaving with what's mine." Daniel leveled the gun at Grant's head. Claire didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy flare gun from the helicopter's emergency rack and leaned out into the wind. Thump! The magnesium flare ignited in a blinding white arc, striking the concrete inches from Daniel's face. The detective screamed, blinded by the 2,000-degree light. In the confusion, Mason lunged forward, grabbing Grant by the tactical vest and dragging him into the cabin. "Go! Go! Go!" Mason bellowed. Jack pulled the collective, and the helicopter lurched into the sky, banking hard away from the estate. Below them, muzzle flashes sparked in the darkness like fireflies as Daniel's men fired blindly into the air. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was frantic. Grant lay on the floor, his eyes fluttering, his breath coming in wet, shallow gasps. "He's in shock," Claire shouted, her nurse's hands moving with a life of their own. She ripped open his shirt, revealing a jagged entry wound near his collarbone. He's got a tension pneumothorax. His lung is collapsing. Jack, how far to the safe house? 20 minutes. But we're being painted by police radar, Jack yelled back. I have to drop below the skyline to lose them. He doesn't have 20 minutes. Claire looked at the meager medical kit in the cabin. No chest tube, no local anesthetic, just a 14-gauge needle and her own steady hands. She looked at Grant, his eyes opened for a second, focusing on hers. In that look, the roles had finally, fully reversed. The man who had broken a detective to save her was now a dying man whose life hung on her ability to stay calm. I've got you, she whispered, leaning over him as the helicopter dived between the skyscrapers of downtown Chicago. I'm the one who saves you now. She positioned the needle over his second intercostal space. As the helicopter pulled a high G turn to avoid a searchlight, Claire plunged the needle into his chest. A violent hiss of trapped air escaped, the sound of a life returning. Grant's chest rose in a jagged, deep breath, and he gripped her wrist, his strength returning even as the city fell away beneath them. The extraction was complete, but as they headed toward the dark forests of the north, Claire knew they weren't just escaping a house. They were leaving the world of the living behind. The safe house was a rustic cabin of heavy timber and reinforced steel, buried deep within a sprawling pine forest that the Chicago winter had turned into a cathedral of ice. As the helicopter blades slowed to a rhythmic thrum and finally died, the silence of the woods rushed in, cold and absolute. Jack and Mason moved with practiced urgency, lifting Grant's limp body from the cabin and carrying him into a hidden medical suite beneath the floorboards. A room that looked like a fragment of a high-end hospital transplanted into the wilderness. Claire didn't wait for them to ask her what to do. The moment Grant was laid onto the sterile table, the nurse who had lived in fear for 2 years vanished. In her place was a woman who understood the language of trauma and the precise geography of the human heart. Mason, get the surgical lights on. Jack, I need the portable ventilator and the suction unit, Claire commanded, her voice steady and sharp. She was already scrubbing her hands, the hot water stinging her skin, but she welcomed the pain. It was a reminder that she was alive, and that the man in the other room was still fighting to stay that way. Grant's face was the color of ash. The bullet had lodged near the apex of his lung, and every breath was a rattling struggle against the blood filling his chest cavity. As Claire stepped to the table, she looked at the tray of instruments, scalpels, forceps, sutures, the tools of her trade. For years, she had used these to fix the damage men like Daniel Cross did to the world. Now, she was using them to save the man who had burned Daniel's world to the ground. The surgery was a blur of high-stakes precision. With Mason acting as her makeshift surgical tech, Claire opened the wound. She worked with a singular focus, her fingers moving through the gore to find the bleeder. When she finally clamped the artery and extracted the mangled lead of the bullet, a heavy, resonant silence filled the room. The heart monitor's frantic beeping settled into a slow, rhythmic pulse. He's stable, Claire whispered, leaning back as the adrenaline began to recede, leaving her limbs heavy and trembling. She spent the next few hours sitting by his side, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. Outside, the sun began to crest over the frozen pines, bleeding a pale, watery gold across the snow. When Grant finally opened his eyes, they weren't the eyes of a dying man. They were dark, piercing, and full of a terrifying clarity. "You stayed," he rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "I finished the lesson," Claire replied, reaching up to touch the jagged diamond necklace that still hung around her neck. "You told me that control has a cost. I think I finally figured out what mine is." Grant looked at her, noticing the way she stood, no longer hunched as if waiting for a blow, no longer glancing at the door in search of an exit. "Daniel isn't dead, Claire. He and Hayes will come for us. They'll bring the Russians, the feds, and anyone else they can buy. This isn't a rescue anymore, it's a revolution." Claire stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dense forest that hid them from the world. For 2 years, she had prayed for someone to save her, thinking she was a victim of a system that didn't care. But looking at her reflection in the glass, the blood on her scrubs, the fire in her eyes, she realized she had been wrong. "I spent 2 years waiting for the law to protect me," she said, her voice low but carrying a terrifying weight. "I thought I was weak because I couldn't stop him. But I realized something tonight, Grant. I'm not the patient, and I'm definitely not the victim." She walked back to the bed and placed her hand over Grant's heart, feeling the strong, steady thud of the life she had fought to keep. "Let Daniel come?" Claire whispered, her gaze unyielding. "Let Hayes bring the whole city. We'll dismantle them. We'll break their badges, we'll break their hold, and we'll break every bone they ever used to hurt someone. We'll do it together." Grant reached up, his large, calloused hand covering hers. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face, a smile of awe and recognition. He saw in her what he had once seen in Abigail, but tempered with a steel that his sister had never lived to forge. "Okay," the Mafia boss replied, his voice regaining its lethal edge. "We do it your way." The wrong text had ended. The right partnership had just begun. Claire Dawson was no longer a nurse hiding in a bathroom. She was the woman holding the leash of the most dangerous man in Chicago. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of the dark. She was the one who was going to make the world fear it.